atrocities. If you ever read a book on Africa, read Balkan, The Ghosts, King Leopold's Ghosts. The missionaries were there to record the story of probably 10 million killed by the owner of the Belgian Congo when he took over that country and forced them into labor and cut off the hands of the Africans who wouldn't work for him. And the missionaries recorded these things and came home on furloughs, and King Leopold paid spies to follow the missionaries on their home circuits as the Presbyterians and Baptists came back and told them, and they wouldn't be allowed back. So the missionaries kind of made a vow of silence. This is one of the great mission issues. Should they have compromised? They did it because they had hospitals and they were there to help the wounded, but they covered up some of the atrocities. But the books are coming out now, and you saw that today. How is it that those foreigners were able to watch that? Who paid somebody to allow them to take photographs of such evil?
And what made some of the missionaries say during the deportations and the killings, instead of returning to the U.S., I'll go with these people wherever they go. So they went, many of them went to Aleppo. Some of the names you read in the box, the last section of the Genocide Museum. Some of these men and women, they came with, and when you get to Haigazian University, it started in 10 rooms, which were the house of two missionary sisters, the Webb sisters, who were in Adana. And then from Adana, they came with the Armenians to where they went and tried to see how they could help them where they went, identifying with the people. I mean, they're not above the people; they're part of the people. So a missionary is the one. Ray, you also, if I may, I think there are two things I want to illustrate. I think one of the contrasts you're making, something we should think about, is the contrast or comparison between the rock monasticism and the desert monasticism, and how that shaped spirituality in different ways. It did. I have Egypt, for example, also in mind. The deserts there, and then some of the Lebanese mountains that you will see where there is some similarity to this one. So the whole how is spirituality shaped differently because of the geographical nature and so on. But what you said about the sand and how the monastery, the desert is for no life, and then suddenly there's a monastery. If you did an Egypt tour, in Egypt there's the Natrun Valley, and there's this Bishoy monastery. In the Bishoy monastery, what struck me was that there's this, for a whole hour, all you see is desert, and then suddenly in the middle of sand and yellow, you see not only a structure, a monastery, but you also see green. Green in the middle of this desert. Why? Because these monks felt not only for themselves, but because they live for life, or they want life, or abundant life. They cannot but plant stuff around. They cannot but want to turn the sand stuff into something green. Now, it's a metaphor maybe, but I'm sure many of you could turn these into good sermons too. Huh? I mean, there's so many other comparisons you can make.
Blooming deserts.
Yeah.
We heard something else today. The Armenians have had to live 900 or 1,000 years without the land that is rightfully theirs. And of course, what they did was learn how to keep their identity. You heard about that? And if I take you to Israel, you'll hear that same story from Jews. We lived and we had to figure out how to keep our identity. And they did it in a variety of ways that even now we're just beginning to understand. I went to Mexico some years ago. I was on the Latin American Mission Board, and my ear stopped up. And in Mexico City, my doctor was Jewish. had a menorah on the wall. I said, when did the Jews come to Mexico? I thought he might say 1910 in the Revolution. He said 1519. I said, with Cortez? He said Cortez was Jewish. He said any Spanish person whose name ends in E-S, E-Z, or Z-A is Jewish. When they forced to convert, they converted and took Christian names, but so they could trace their Jewish legacy, they used this signature endings. So somebody named Cortez or Carranza, Z-A, or Lopez. Now, over the 500 years, that has broken down to some extent. But my friend Sam Escobar, whose PhD in Barcelona was on these kinds of issues, confirms that this is true. So, Jews and Muslims lived together in Catholic Spain, and when they were forced out, Arabs often went to Africa again, but now are coming back as the new Moros in Spain, as Muslims. The Jews got on boats and came, for example, to South America, to Colombia. When they got off the boats, the Christians went to Bogota, the Jews went to Medellin, and Medellin was a Jewish city in South America, of people who were leaving Spain. And so, when I was a history student in the university 40 years ago, nobody was studying this. Now, everybody is studying this. The whole history is about how these oppressed groups keep their identity, track their reality. The Chinese, Peter, if you go to Indonesia, the same thing. They were forced to adopt Indonesian names. They did so, but they found a way to keep their identity. And I see that in Bangkok as well, and Thailand. The Chinese are the Jews of the Orient. Yeah, and so it's interesting how these ethnic groups are coming into the new focus of new studies in history, cultural anthropology. The new book by Dermot McCulloch in Oxford on church history is called Christianity the First 3,000 Years. It digs 1,000-year roots of the early church and then how those flourished after Christ. And so there's much more appreciation for the multi-ethnic nature of the church than used to be 40 years ago when everybody went to Princeton to study the history of the Western tradition. Yale was the center of that kind of thinking. So many of these issues will keep coming up, but I remind you, we've already seen quite an emergence of
in one day.
In one day, of things to think about.
Ray, maybe now would be a good